So, when you think about the Persian Empire versus the Greeks, what comes to mind? Probably massive invasions, right? Epic battles. But was that really the whole story? Because if you look at a pretty crucial 60-year window, Persian policy looks like it's all over the place. I mean, it swings from all-out war to super quiet diplomacy. So that's the big question, isn't it? Was this just a total mess, a bunch of chaotic reactions, or was there some kind of grand strategy humming along underneath it all? All right, let's dig in and find out.
Okay, to really get a sense of just how wild this shift was, you gotta start with where Persia began. And their ambition? Well, let's just say it was absolutely limitless.
And this quote right here from Mardonius, King Xerxes' top general, man, it just sums up their mindset perfectly. We're not talking about some small border dispute here. No, this is about total, absolute conquest. The goal was to literally swallow Greece whole, to make it just another part of the Persian Empire.
But then, you fast forward just a few decades, and the Persian way of dealing with a Greek problem, it looks completely, totally different. It's like they went from this sky-high, world-conquering ambition to something much, much smaller.
Yep, 700. That's how many mercenaries a Persian governor sent to meddle in a Greek civil war. Think about that. Not a giant world-conquering army, but a tiny little force, basically hired guns for a local squabble. So what on earth happened? How do you go from wanting to own God's own sky to just sending 700 soldiers? That's the puzzle.
All right, to solve that puzzle, let's break it down into acts. And Act 1 of their policy, well, it was defined by one thing and one thing only: conquest. This was the era of the great kings, of massive, unstoppable invasion forces.
And you can see this clear pattern, right? It just keeps escalating. First, in 492, a general, Mardonius, is sent to just grab as many Greek towns as he can. Then, after that famous setback at Marathon, does King Darius give up? Nope. He doubles down, orders an even bigger army. And then, a decade later, his son Xerxes decides to do it himself, personally leading one of the biggest invasions the ancient world had ever seen. The key thing to get here is that this wasn't random. It was a deliberate, top-down plan from the king himself, with one goal: total subjugation.
And the scale, it's just staggering. Herodotus tells us that for 3 whole years, all Asia was in an uproar, getting ready for this one invasion. This wasn't some minor border skirmish. This was the entire empire, all its resources pointed at one target, a total, all-in commitment.
But then, everything changes. The big invasions fail, and Persian policy enters a completely new phase, a total 180. They pull way back from direct confrontation and shift to this much more cautious, kind of hands-off approach. And that created a whole new ballgame.
And this really just lays the contrast bare, doesn't it? Look at this. You go from the royal plan, the great king himself leading a massive invasion for total conquest, to the governor's gambit. Just a local governor, a satrap, hiring a tiny force, and here's the kicker: only when a Greek faction asks him to. The leadership, the scale, the objective, literally everything is turned completely on its head.
So this new reality, it gets kind of formalized in something we call the Peace of Calais, around 449 BC. And look at these terms. Persia agrees that the Greek cities over in Asia, they get to be self-governing. Persian armies got to stay a 3-day journey away from the sea. Persian warships banned from key Greek waters. It's a total, complete abandonment of that old goal of making the sky their boundary. They're basically accepting hard lines on the map, and they're on the wrong side of them.
And it's funny, ancient historians couldn't even agree if this was a real, formal, signed-on-the-dotted-line treaty. But at the end of the day, it almost doesn't matter. The effect was the same. As Plutarch points out, the Persians just stayed away. Their behavior completely changed. They went from being the aggressors to being, absentees.
But hold on, is it really that simple? Is it just a complete flip-flop? Because there's a counter-argument. Some historians say, wait a minute, if you look closer, maybe the goal was the same the whole time. Maybe it wasn't the what that changed, just the how.
And this is a really fascinating way to think about it. Look here. Early on, Persia tried imposing democracies in Ionia. Why? To stop revolts. Okay. Then, decades later, what do? They grant those same cities autonomy in a treaty. Why? To stop revolts. The methods are total opposites, right? One is control, the other is freedom. But could the goal underneath it all have been exactly the same? Just give us a stable, peaceful frontier that doesn't cause us headaches. It's a pretty compelling idea.
And here's another potential threat of consistency. Persia's policy was often reactive, not proactive. They didn't just invade out of the blue. Their biggest campaigns were pitched as payback for Greek provocations, like when Athens helped burn down the major Persian city of Sardis. And even those later, smaller interventions, they were responses to requests. So maybe the consistent policy all along was just, don't poke the bear, but if you do, we'll react.
Okay, so we've got two really strong arguments on the table. One says the policy was radically transformed, a complete 180. The other argues for a sneaky underlying consistency. So when we actually weigh all the evidence, which story really holds up?
Honestly, when you lay it all out like this, the argument for a fundamental, game-changing shift is just incredibly powerful. The difference in scale, from massive imperial armies to tiny mercenary forces, the difference in authority, from the great king himself to a regional governor, and the difference in the objective, from conquest to just boundary maintenance. These changes are just too big, too vast to be explained away as just different tactics. The verdict seems pretty clear. The policy was truly, deeply transformed.
Now, of course, figuring all this stuff out is not easy for historians. I mean, think about it. Our main source for the big invasions, Herodotus, gives us all this incredible, juicy detail. But then, for the later period, our guy Thucydides is way more brief. He just kind of summarizes it. On top of that, the ancient writers themselves were arguing over whether the Peace of Callias was even a real treaty. And honestly, this is the kind of messy, conflicting evidence that makes history so frustrating, but also so incredibly interesting to piece together.
So if you look at the whole timeline, it really tells a clear story, doesn't it? You start with this intense age of invasion, all-out war. That's followed by a period where the Greeks start pushing back and Persia is forced out of the Aegean. Then you hit that huge turning point around 449 BC with the Peace of Callias, whether it was formal or not. And after that, decades of Persian withdrawal, just quiet. It's a clear, unmistakable narrative of retreat.
And that leaves us with one last really big question to chew on. When we look at this whole story, this dramatic shift in policy, are we looking at a colossal failure? A story of an empire that just couldn't hack it? Or are we seeing something way more interesting? Are we seeing the calculated, pragmatic choice of a superpower? An empire that was smart enough to realize that some frontiers, some fights, just aren't worth the cost? What do you think?